Why is mental health thought as an afterthought to any pandemic or natural disaster? Why is there no prevention done?
The evolution of health. So everybody first talks about fractures and heart attacks, strokes and delirium, and only over after that people will start talking about depression and anxiety, because ages ago somebody is saying, how can somebody think of mental health if one's stomach is not full? The hassle with COVID was that nobody knew anything about the future, so we were all learning on the job. People in the media were certainly not making it easier for any of us. I think the governments did a terrific job. There's absolutely no getting away from the fact. We've had kids with special needs who had reached a particular level, suddenly they've regressed. He told me that previous night in the morning he cremated his mother and in the evening he cremated his sister. What am I going to do to make it better?
Disasters do affect the structure of the brain. How long does it take to correct?
I deal a lot with child use. Imagine if you were in a place where this was happening 24 hours a day.
What is the difference between then psychological resilience and numbness?
That there's a guy, the wife comes in and says, I'm shouting and screaming at him and he's just looking at me.
Yeah.
What is that? Is that numbness? Is that a coping mechanism?
I had a 7-year-old coming and telling me that when I open my mouth and I'm breathing with my mouth, I can chew dust.
Yes, road construction is wonderful and we should have all the greenery and all of that. Those 10 years are going to be filled with... I would actually believe that every governmental body should have a psychiatrist on it. Let's not believe that we are that omnipotent.
Hello everyone, welcome to Judge Me Not. Today's episode is very special and so is our guest. He is the past president of the Bombay Psychiatric Society and a consultant at PD Hinduja National Hospital, Hinduja Healthcare and Shri HN Reliance Foundation Hospital. He currently chairs the Indian Psychiatric Society Task Force on School Psychiatry and Counseling. He was a panel member of the IPS Task Force on Ethical Boundaries Between Clients and Doctors, now adopted by the Indian Medical Council. As former chairperson of the IPS Task Force on LGBTQ and mental health, he led the release of the position statement cited in the landmark judgment repealing Section 377. He also served on the IPS Task Force for Autism Spectrum Disorder Treatment Guidelines and chaired the IPS Task Forces on College Psychiatry and Media Relations. His primary interest is in child psychiatry, and he was part of the first Maharashtra government panel that established concessions for learning disabilities in Mumbai. He has contributed chapters to 4 books and he has been a TEDx speaker. So please welcome none other than Dr. Kersi Chavda. Welcome, Dr. Kersi Chavda.
Thank you.
So, of course, today we're going to talk about natural disasters, pandemics, and its impact on mental health, because we all have been through a major pandemic in the past, very recent past, in fact, COVID-19. Um, I just wanted to ask you, doctor, and a very crucial question that has been on my mind for quite some time is, why is mental health thought as an afterthought to any pandemic or natural disaster? Why is there no prevention done? Why is it always after everything is done?
Yeah.
Then we talk about mental health.
I guess that's part of the evolution of health. So everybody first talks about, fractures and heart attacks and strokes and delirium. And only over after that, people will start talking about depression and anxiety, because they're not very visible.
Right.
So if stuff is not very visible, it doesn't really come in the public consciousness. And you have people who, of course, are still based on, the past, where they say, okay, how can you be depressed and how can you be anxious? You don't look it. The hassle is that this wrong perception still persists in a lot of people. So it's like, if you're depressed, then you have to cry, and if you're anxious, then you have to have a panic attack,
Correct.
which really is not true. I guess it also, I remember ages ago somebody saying, how can somebody think of mental health if one's stomach is not full? So when we get money, technically, we'd like to look after our food, clothing, and shelter. And only after that, one tends to look at
The
whether the
mind.
person is happy or whether the person is sad or whether the person is psychotic. Maybe that's why. I think the trend is changing. There's
It
no getting
is.
away from the
It
fact
is.
that people are talking much more about it. I mean, 25 years ago, I don't think I would have been in your program. You wouldn't have had a program on this. No? So things are changing. There's no question about this change. The change is slow, but it's picking up with momentum. And hopefully, it will continue becoming much more commonplace in the future to talk about mental health as well.
Absolutely. I mean, even Bill Gates in one of his interviews had mentioned that the next big pandemic is a mental health
Mental health
pandemic.
pandemic.
Um,
And we are already in it.
yeah.
I mean, if you're looking at it, I mean, India may be not such a developed country, but we are incredibly developed if we look at mental health issues. We also have to look at the fact that we have this huge population, right? So even if we talk about 25% of our population having some variety or other of a mental illness, 25% of so many billion is
Hmm.
not a small thing. And if we do not gear ourselves up to doing something that reduces whatever is happening around us, we're going to be inundated. And that's already seen. My colleagues and I are all getting burnt out. My colleagues and I can't cope. My colleagues and I are finding it difficult to sustain our own enthusiasm because over a period of time, it just becomes too exhausting. So it's not really a reflection of what is happening in our society, it's a reflection of just whatever is happening in the world. Uh,
So how are you
how do
coping?
I cope with it?
Yeah.
Well, I work out a lot, so that helps. I have friends who are not psychiatrists, so that helps.
So important.
So important. If you're with a doctor and a psychiatrist and all you talk about is patients,
Absolutely.
I have a very, very strong family support system which helps tremendously, including a wife who keeps me grounded and doesn't let me act like the ass she sometimes believe I act like. So that
That's how
helps.
you cope. The trends that you are seeing amongst mental health practitioners, especially whenever something like this happens, like there's a pandemic, I'm sure there must have been you yourself set up
I
helpline.
set up 5 helplines.
Right.
There was one national one. There was one only for the Bombay Psychiatric Society. I mean, I was part of the thing for the Bombay Psychiatric Society. A pharmaceutical setup one. And they asked me to look after it because it was absolutely essential for them because they said that we don't realize, but they are delivering drugs all over the place, medication. And they didn't know whether they'd come back alive because at that time there was such a hype about COVID and
Right.
you get out into the open and you're going to die and stuff like that. So that was a big thing. They were having major issues amongst the people who were working for them. There was a psychological part which group which also set up their own counseling services and they needed psychiatrists in order to be able to refer to them. So there was a huge amount of stuff happening during COVID. One of the things, of course, that came to our mind very, very strongly was that if you're not aware really of the consequences of what is happening, it becomes more difficult. So, for example, supposing I have malaria, I know that X amount of days I'll have fever, I'll have chills, I can take this medication and all will be fine. I might have some severe complications. The hassle with COVID was that nobody knew anything about the future. So we were all learning on the job. There was a hit and miss thing at times. People in the media were certainly not making it easier for any of us. I think the governments did a terrific job. There's absolutely no getting away from the fact. I mean, I'm in Bombay, and I think our city has done a fantastic job. We had such small, little, densely packed areas where we could have just wiped out the population, and that didn't happen. So that was wonderful. But it's left an enormous residual impact. If you're looking at adults, you suddenly find yourself very, very vulnerable. You don't know what is going to happen. You don't know if you're going to work, whether you're going to come back with the illness. You don't know whether if you get the illness, you're going to survive. We see people around us dying. We see people around us having major issues. And those are the adults who can actually comprehend what is happening. You have kids, and suddenly kids are at home, and initially it's great fun, but over a period of time, it's not. And we're talking about kids who don't have issues. Kids who have issues, who normally would have a packed schedule going to an occupational therapist or a speech therapist or a physiotherapist, and suddenly they're not there. And however much a special educator or whoever can manage to do things on the
Online.
online,
It's
it's
not the
not the
same.
same. I mean, if I have a physical issue problem and the physiotherapist has to bend my hand or my leg in a particular way or make me stretch in a particular way, that's not going to happen online. So we've had an enormous amount of regression also that has occurred. We've had kids with special needs who had reached a particular level, suddenly they've regressed. They're not at that level. They've come down 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years,
Oh
which
my
is
God.
terrible. We've had no kids, so-called normal kids in school, who, because they were home all the time for so many years, found it very difficult to get back. I mean, when schools reopened, colleges reopened, we were all like, oh, everything will be fine, but it wasn't.
It wasn't.
Yeah,
It took a lot of time to adjust.
getting back into normalcy was incredibly difficult. And the sad thing also was that almost every family knew of somebody or had somebody who had actually died in
Died
the
of.
pandemic. And it's not easy. You have a 30-year-old kid who suddenly dies. You have a 60-year-old, prime of health, who's no longer alive. It's very difficult to cope with something that is so nebulous and for which even us as doctors really had very few answers. So we coped, but very often we were given a bad name also because we couldn't cope adequately, and that became an issue. As it is,
Yeah.
we have a lot of
How
emotion.
could you cope?
Well,
I mean,
doctors are supposed to do everything, isn't it? And if we don't do everything, then it's either that we are money raking people or that we don't know enough or that we are the biggest asses in the world. So it's difficult.
that's harsh.
It's difficult. It's difficult. Of course, at the other end of the spectrum, we also have people who bow down and, say that you're wonderful and you saved us and all of that. But it's a tough life.
Now, after this has happened, after the pandemic, did you come across cases of PTSD? Grief, of course, I'm sure. Um, but did you come across more cases of PTSD?
Well, I think PTSD is an all encompassing term which may not really mean too much. But yes, for what it's worth, there was a lot of it. I mean, anybody who was in it probably woke up with nightmares, wondered whether they'd be alive, wondered if they could have done something different so that somebody wouldn't have died, etc., etc. So you have
Right.
that survivor guilt thing
Correct.
happening. You wonder why only you and your entire family stayed alive. I've had horrendous cases. I mean, I was sent somebody, and what do I do with this person? He told me that that previous night in the morning he cremated his mother, and in the evening he cremated his sister. What am I going to do to make it better? I had somebody who came in with a family, grandfather. They stayed with the grandfather, two kids, and two grandchildren. The two adults, the son and the daughter-in-law of the grandfather, died. The two kids died. Grandfather's alive. I mean, things like that, when they happen, you really wonder what is the purpose of this life. And when we start thinking like that, then that's not very good.
So how did you did you
Did I
try,
cope? Yeah, of course
not
we
just
all.
cope, but did you find any answers or did
There was no
you go on
answer.
a quest?
There was no answer. But then there are no answers to a lot of things. What is the answer to the fact that a 6-year-old gets cancer? What's the answer to the fact that we have horrendous cases of child sexual abuse, which make you wonder whether the person is a human being? And things like that.
True.
So sometimes there are just no answers.
Uh, Doctor, when something like this happens, when there is a pandemic, or not just pandemic, any natural disaster where a person loses everything, property, loved ones, um, there's destruction everywhere. You completely lose control of the situation. What exactly happens in the brain?
So there's an enormous amount of research now that points more to a genetic predisposition to a person who behaves in a particular way. So if you have 10 people who are in the same situation, you'll have 5 who are absolutely devastated. I mean, I'm just saying 5, it could be more, but you have X amount of people who are absolutely devastated. And you check on them after about 5 years, and it's like they've not moved ahead at all, or hardly moved ahead. You have, of the remaining 5, maybe 2 or 3 who move ahead a little bit. They cope a little bit. They still are not as good as they used to be in the past. And you have about 2 or 3 who are doing very well. It's like they used those obstacles as stepping stones to progress. And the only thing, because they all faced the same situation, were in the same boat, etc., the only thing that was different was genes. So obviously it was a genetic predisposition. So the way we behave to a large extent depends on our genes. Of course, there is a certain amount of uh, stimulus which can also cause a problem. I mean, the psychosocial, the environment, etc. And over here, there was consistent stress related to COVID, which came in the environment. But everybody who reacted differently because of his genetic makeup. Now, there are structures in the brain that get affected. There are channels in the brain that get affected. Some amount of neurotransmitters. I mean, everybody now talks of serotonin, dopamine, epinephrine, but there are hundreds and hundreds of them.
Absolutely.
So everything is not serotonin and dopamine. So all of these things get affected. Uh, and you have, I mean, if you do scans, etc., you can actually see changes in the structure of the brain. So there are brain structures which get affected as well. All of these things happen, and then depending on what gets affected, you'll end up having a particular kind of reaction, a particular kind of action, which then becomes part of your personality. And then you'll end up getting into the so-called depression and the so-called anxiety, none of which is actually sacrosanct and compartmentalized. I mean, I don't think I've ever come across a person who's depressed who doesn't have some anxiety and doesn't have some obsessive features, etc., etc. So, these are just little silos which we put emotions and behaviors in. They help us in terms of treatment, but one doesn't look at them as sacrosanct little compartments. Yeah.
Absolutely. So let's say, because yes, trauma or disasters do affect the structure of the brain. How long does it take to correct that? Does it even happen?
Yeah, so we don't know how much it takes to correct them, but the latest thing normally is now that you just let the medication, if you're giving medication, you let it continue for a long time period. So we look at it now in terms of diabetes or in terms of a blood pressure, that very often, even though your sugar might come under control, you stop the sugar, you stop the medication and the sugar increases again. You're hypertensive, you get in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 medicines which finally control your blood pressure. And your blood pressure comes under control, then you get into this thing of, should I stop my blood pressure tablets? We don't do that. You're born and your doctor checks you out and finds that you have a thyroid dysfunction and you're on a thyroid supplement for the rest of your life. Nobody says at the end of 10 years that I'm going to stop it. Unfortunately, my medication, everybody says, can I stop? Can I stop? Can I stop? Can I stop? And we try to say no, try to avoid stopping because we know that it's not going to be helpful. And then they come into, but oh, he'll be dependent on it. So I say, are you dependent on blood pressure tablets? Are you dependent on hypertensives? But you're okay with them. Yes, but this affects the brain. Well, I've got news for you. Most of the anti-diabetics and most of the hypertensives work through the brain as well. Somehow that's okay. And the funny thing also is a gastroenterologist gives my medication because it settles the stomach. You take it for the rest of your life. But if he sends the patient to me and I write exactly that same medicine, it'll become, oh, I'm taking a psychiatric medication. I think we have to get over that. And most of us now are talking about it very vociferously. So it is proving there is some change. It's not as fast and as much as we'd like. So it gets a little trying if you're seeing 10 patients in a day who are constantly saying reduce, 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 reduce. Eventually, they have to make a decision. We provide them with the statistics and the research and the advice that if you've come to me as a professional, I have to tell you what you should be doing because we know that if you stop it, the chances of a relapse or a recurrence is extremely high. And then to get people back into normalcy takes much longer and much more medication is needed, etc., etc.
So talking about natural disasters and pandemics, have you ever come across any people or communities where um, there's been disaster after disaster after disaster? For example, very recently I was watching this documentary jahan pe um, when Taliban took over Afghanistan this time around, they were,
Yeah,
seated in a court of law, which was literally in a garage kind of a place. And you see the difference between how the woman who was seeking justice, the way she was speaking, very, calm, almost numbed,
yeah.
isolated emotions, even, versus probably somebody in another um, cultural or a regional background. So, is there something that causes that fatigue, numbness,
Absolutely. There's no
emotional?
question about it. Over a period of time, one gets numb. One sees so much of negativity. One sees so much of horrible things happening that one can't cope anymore. I deal a lot with child sexual abuse. I mean, after so many years in the business, I still get this stomach wrenching experience, and I feel like bringing up. And I have so often I've gone home very quiet, and my wife just says, "Bad patient," and I say yes, and she leaves me be because she knows that I need time to
Right, right.
detach. Imagine if you were in a place where this was happening 24 hours a day. I think after a while, I don't know what you do. You'd switch off, you detach, you become numb, you become non-feeling, you just don't take in anymore, and then maybe sometimes you erupt. Now that sounds very simplistic and non-scientific, but sometimes it does happen. Um, Unfortunately, TRPs is very big, so you have the newspapers filled with only negative news. I'd love to see a newspaper which has only positive news for a change. I think it'd be so lovely. In my groups where we are doctors talking, most of the time we are only talking about negatives. So when you actually talk about positive things that happen in your life, it feels so good. I'm on social media. I try to post happy things also. And if I'm actually looking at the negatives in my life, I have had experiences which I hope none of my colleagues will have in the future. But I've had so many positives. I've had so many people praying for me. I've had so many people saying, let's go and smack those guys. So those kind of things make so much of a difference. So if we can manage, I'm not saying that, when you walk, you blow kisses to everybody and that there are butterflies floating around and twinkling stars, but everything is not negative. Now imagine if you're in a place where you're not respected. Like from what I've gathered in Afghanistan, the rights of women really are horrendous. Imagine if you're considered to be a second class citizen. Imagine if you're not allowed to play. You can't come on television, so on and so forth. You can't talk to a person you don't know. I mean, I cannot even imagine that situation. I cannot imagine how any of us would be able to live. And if you're stuck there, you don't have a way out. What do? You learn how
Shut
to,
down.
you shut down, you learn how to cope. And unfortunately, sometimes you become worse than the person who's trying to shut you down because that's the only way you can cope. Which is why they say, no, that a person who's been abused becomes a bigger abuser on occasion.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's a horrible life we live sometimes.
And a lot of change happens at the infrastructure level. For example, Japan.
Yeah.
They just changed the way they constructed their buildings, right? Because they were just disaster,
Too many
too
earthquakes.
many of them, right? What I wanted to ask you is what what is the difference between then psychological resilience and numbness? How
Well, I
would
think
you?
resilience is that you still feel, but you cope. Numbness is you don't feel. Resilience would be that if I see a guy who's having a heart attack, I'd still run to help him, even though I've seen 100,000 heart attacks and most of them have died. Numbness is, oh, he's getting a heart attack. Okay, he's going to die anyway. So sometimes you have, I mean, even in your therapy, when you're doing therapy, you must have seen that there's a guy, I mean, the wife comes in and says, I'm shouting and screaming at him and he's just
It's
looking
just
at me. Yeah.
yeah.
What is that? Is that numbness? Is that a coping mechanism?
Apathy, just
Apathy? Yeah.
yeah.
Could be just a depressive thing, could be something else. But unless we actually evaluate, it's very difficult for us to say, you know, which is why it's so important that everybody should know a psychiatrist.
Absolutely. But it must be difficult to evaluate as well, right?
It is. But I keep telling people, I go to a gym in the morning and about 20 to 30% of the people in the gym come to me. I it's becoming funny now that wherever I go, there are people who come up to me and say, "Hi, how are you? We used to come to you." I've been associated with a number of schools.
Right.
So as the kids grow up, they come up to me, coming running up, and they say, "Hey, Dr. Chowda, you remember us?" And I'm horrendously bad at names. So I say, I know you, but I don't know your name." So they go into, "Oh, I was in this school and you dealt with me." It's lovely. The trend is certainly changing. This would not have happened 20 years ago,
Agreed.
where people come up in the open. I know I was at a club the other day, one of the clubs, and there was some music going on, and I was dancing with my wife. And the song got over, and it was a beautiful song. So we just did this to the guy. And on the mic, he says, "Dr. Chowda, it's so lovely to see you here. I'm glad that even psychiatrists can dance." And I was like, "Okay." And he came up to me in the short recess. In the short break, I'm saying recess. And he says, "I used to come to you 10 years ago." Lovely.
Yeah.
So if things like that are more and more open, and it's taken as all right that if you have a problem, you just go and seek help. And who the hell cares about uh, you know, what will people say? What will people say if you have a breakdown? What will people say if you commit suicide? What will people say if you get into a panic attack all the time?
Correct.
What will your boss say if because of your restlessness, you can't, even though you have the ability to do well, you can't manage to perform the way you should? So all of these things make a difference when you
Anyway,
seek
people are
approach.
going to say something or the other.
Absolutely.
But medication and therapy is such a private thing. I mean,
I know. I keep telling people you don't necessarily have to put a T-shirt on
Yeah.
saying I'm going to a shrink.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But I have a lot. I'm so thrilled that I have a lot of, shall we say, very public people also who come out on social media saying it's because of you we are alive, and that's lovely. That's
I've read
absolutely
those posts.
okay. So I also have a lot of asses who've never seen me and who've written stuff about what they've read or heard about me. So people have to be a little more mature
Absolutely.
and not necessarily believe the media when they say what the media says.
True. Absolutely. So, Doctor, coming to frontline workers as well, I think they were one of the most
Vulnerable.
vulnerable. In fact, there was this doctor who was kicked out of her society,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
उसको आने ही नहीं दिया
I know.
अंदर,
I know.
right? And there was, I'm sure, many
All over
many.
the place. Yes.
Did you come
Did I
across?
ever experience anything like that? No. And have I come across people who've been? I was told that uh, that there were a couple of doctors who told me that when they came into their colony back, or when they came into their house again, uh, after they used the lift, it was suggested to housekeeping to kind of disinfect it. Okay.
What do you think needs to be done to prepare mentally for any future? Because now, because of climate change,
Climate change is going to be horrendous. We are already seeing so much of it. People only look at it again in terms of the physical aspects. So, of course, you have kids and adults who are constantly coughing and sneezing and getting bronchitis and getting pneumonias and things like that. But we are also looking at the fact that when that happens, anyway, over a period of time, you're going to get very depressed if you're stuck at home. You're going to have economic problems because you can't go to work. If it gets very, very bad, you become very weak and you can't work, then you have to give up your job. If that happens, then the people in your family are going to get very badly affected, and all of us have people who are dependent on us. In addition to that, side effects of antibiotics, side effect of the other things that are happening. A lot of you are put on steroids. They're wonderful drugs, but they have their own attendant problems. Sometimes you have restricted mobility. Because of that, you can't walk. And if you are very, very physically active and suddenly you can't walk, it causes a problem. However much everybody says our economy is great, it's not in the best shape. So anyway, it's difficult to get a job. And if you are not performing up to the level that you should just because of your physical problems, very often it's suggested that you take a pay cut or that you work from home, so there's a pay cut, or that you actually leave the job, or you come back after 4 months when you're absolutely okay, or longer than that, etc., etc. All of that has its repercussions on
mental health.
mental health. Now, when I was a medical student, for example, we talked of autism spectrum disorders.
Yeah.
We would say at that time, many, many years ago, it was 1 in 100. Today it's 1 in about 39 or 40.
40.
So if you're looking at it, what has caused the problem? Nobody really knows. Everybody is hypothesizing. Of course, there's better reporting and more awareness,
Yeah.
but everybody is hypothesizing that there's something in the environment which is causing a problem. You don't know as yet. At one time, it was all vaccine, 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 which is all nonsense. It's been disproved. But we are looking at it in terms of something in the environment which is causing a problem. I have no doubt we'll find a lot of other things in the environment which are going to increase mental health conditions.
Yeah.
So, what do we need to do? We need to be as, I mean, unfortunately, I love my motherland, but it's one of the dirtiest places that we've ever been in. You go abroad and you come back and you say, why? Why do people still spit? Why is there still
Garbage.
garbage all over? I mean, I had Americans coming in and we were talking to them, doctors, and they said, Doc, why can't you do something about all the trash on the ground? And it's it's not nice, because I can't even say you're talking nonsense, because it's true. I mean, I stay in Bandra, which is considered to be very posh, and it's disgustingly dirty at times, the market areas. And there's so little that you need to do in order to make it better. I don't think we have even 10 dustbins in Bandra. We need something like 1,000.
Right.
That's all we need. But anyway, to come back to it, so I have no doubt that there will be mental health issues related to pollution, that there will be mental health issues related to the environment. And now, when we're looking at the environment, you get into a state where the water gets polluted. Then you have to do things to get it okay, which is again very financially important. You get, sometimes it's not possible. So then you'll end up getting illnesses related to water pollution. You can't do much about the air pollution, mostly temperature. So you have global warming, which will cause its own attendant problems on agriculture and things like that. You have problems associated with the environment and the particulate matter that is increasing. I mean, we used to say that Bombay was so good in terms of pollution in comparison to, say, Delhi or Haryana. But I believe this year we've actually had days where our AQI was higher than that of Delhi, which is terrible. I mean, I would look out of my window and I couldn't see the house opposite. Never ever had that situation. And I think it'll only increase.
Yesterday, my daughter's pediatrician was telling me that because she's been having allergies on and off like for a very long time, and he said, you know what, Sonal, I had a 7-year-old coming and telling me that when I open my mouth and I'm breathing with my mouth, I can chew dust.
Woof. That's not a
So,
nice
right,
state
yeah.
of affairs. I think our reconstruction has just gone out of control, and the number of vehicles on the road also doesn't add to
So
it.
everything just
Everything.
adding up to it. Um, so in preparation, so let's say if a preparation has to happen at an individual level, then community level, then also society level, and even probably implementing certain things along with the government hand in hand. If you feel that mental health practitioners can be a part of that planning process, project planning, what would you suggest?
So, first of all, we have to be aware of the fact that it's that when you have a mental illness, it's not related to bad parenting. It's not related to the fact that you weren't breastfed enough. It's not that you did or didn't do the right thing. It just happens to anybody.
Right.
If you're talking of about 25% of the population, that's a lot of people. So what we need to do is be aware of it, to talk about it a lot. If you're talking about it, then we also need to be working in conjunction with governmental bodies and things like that. A little bit of that is happening. It needs much, much more attenuation. So I would actually believe that every governmental body should have a psychiatrist on it, so that we are also aware of the fact that yes, road construction is wonderful and we should have all the greenery and all of that, but in the process, and if it takes 10 years, do it. Those 10 years are going to be filled with people who are going to have severe issues,
Yeah.
especially in that area. So what can we do to mitigate their problems? This whole thing of, cut trees, cut mangroves and all, I think we need to change. We have guardian ministers sometimes who talk stuff which is a little frightening. So we need to get people who are a little more environmental conscious about what is happening. I believe that there are individuals who are working and who have done brilliant work on barren areas. We need to get them into the national focus and work on them. Just like we have Dr. Baba Amte, who used to
Right.
work for, the marginalized, and who's done such fantastic work in the health field. I have no doubt we'll get people who are working in environment who are not well known, but who do their own little thing and make so much of a difference in the world. And finally, we need to shift. We need to get more into uh, not believing that it's I, me, mine, but it's ours. And if it is ours, then we need to leave a legacy for our kids, which is frightening. Your child is going to face up to many, many more problems than we had related to the environment because there's just such a degradation. So, unless it changes, a lot of people are saying we've already crossed the line, and even however much we change, we won't be able to
Go back.
go back. Hopefully, that is being too alarmist and it will change. I mean, I remember when COVID was happening and garbage was not being thrown the way it is, we actually saw dolphins in Bombay. I mean, can
Yeah.
you actually imagine that? I haven't seen that in 50 years.
Oh, yes, yes,
Yes.
yes. Right.
So things like that can happen.
Wonderful. And now the pandemic, so I don't know if this is a pandemic or not, the GBS, Guillain-Barré
Yes.
syndrome that's happening, Pune and I
Yeah.
think Solapur currently. It's more frightening because somehow it's an autoimmune condition, right? Which is, how is that even
I know. So nobody really knows. They're talking about contaminated
right?
water, but they haven't really come to a conclusion. And if it is, then it's a horrible indictment of the municipality. Because these things are controllable. They should never have happened in the first place. So when you have something that you can't do much about, so for example, you have an earthquake, okay, you couldn't have stopped the earthquake.
Correct.
But if you could have built buildings, like you say in Japan, in
Right.
such a way that even if it's an earthquake, you're
They-
not going to collapse. You just move a little bit and you settle down again. And you choose not to do it. And there's something wrong somewhere. So somehow, if only our VIPs could be in a situation where they face up to the traumas that the normal citizenry faces, then I think things change. I know that there was a VIP coming in my area and suddenly the roads looked so spotless. It was lovely. It was absolutely lovely. But they can do it every day then, no? And if we do it and it looks so good, why not? There are days now, I think they're talking of deep cleaning the city and so on.
Right.
But
One off.
I think a lot more needs to be done.
Yeah.
And this thing of no dustbins really gets my goat. How can you not have dustbins in a place like Mumbai?
That's a lot to think about.
That's a lot to think.
And where do you start?
You start in your own way. You start with your own recycling at home. You start with your own not throwing things. I mean, I remember the other day I was traveling in my car and next to me was a Mercedes and the guy threw a cardboard out. And I actually pulled my window down and I tapped on his window and he pulled his window down and I said, "Do you think you should have done that?" And he was so startled. He says, "I'm so sorry." And he actually got out and picked it up and he took it in. We need to be a little proactive. I don't think people are necessarily bad. I think they just don't know enough, don't care enough, think it's okay. Anyway, everybody else does it. I'll just add to that. What the heck?
Exactly.
But everybody should realize that that little bit you do makes all the difference in the world.
Let's say we do prevent a lot of pandemics. We do prevent the psychological resilience and the frustration tolerance, that all of that does happen. How do you see the next generation?
Well, I think the next generation, unfortunately, is going to be in a position where they have to undo a lot of the wrong we've done. So we talk about artificial intelligence. Hopefully, they'll use it appropriately and positively rather than negatively. I mean, you'll always have the bad person who'll use it badly, but if it can be used and harnessed to make life better for the multitude of citizens, then it'll be wonderful. If we don't have, if we can utilize it even in the health sphere and provide some kind of help in places where it is not available. I mean, it's already happening. For example, a small village somewhere in the interiors can show a CT scan to somebody in Mumbai who can just say, "This is happening, do this."
Right.
You could never have thought of this years ago. I remember in COVID, years ago, I mean, 4 years ago, there was on one of my national telephone things, there was this guy who had called me from the interiors of a place in, I can't remember where it was, Bihar or somewhere.
Okay.
And he told me, he described what was happening to him, and he described basically a panic attack. So I told him, you need to get some medication, and I'll write it out for you. He says, where he stays, there is no chemist.
Pharmacy.
So he'll have to walk about 10 kilometers to the closest chemist. He said he'll go there and he'll call me. So after about 2-3 hours or whatever, because he had other work to do, he reached there and then he called me from there and I spoke to the chemist. The chemist didn't have what I prescribed, but he had something else, very, very open, very nice. And he gave the guy the medicines. After about a month, that guy called me back saying that he's feeling great. He's never been happier in his life. His panic has gone. He's feeling
Wonderful.
in control. And he wound up by saying, if you ever come to Bihar and you come to my city, do come over. I'll give you chai and chapatis. And that was just so sweet.
Wow.
That was just so. That's what a typical Indian is. I like to think that's what a typical Indian is.
Right.
He's generous to a fault. He'll go out of his way to make you feel good, provided he likes you. And I'd like to think that is the way that we should all look at our fellow brothers and sisters. Let's try to do the best we can for everybody and not necessarily only look at what we can do to make ourselves and our own lives better.
Right.
Let's look at making everybody's life better.
Yeah, there's a higher purpose anyway, sets you on that path of motivation and also
Sure.
happiness, definitely.
And that higher purpose is not going to be dealt with unless mental health is looked after.
That's great. Any words of wisdom apart from
What I just said.
yes.
Dr. Google is not a doctor, which I believe in very strongly. It causes so much of anguish. Let me also say that you could do research on whatever things you have for 3 days, 5 days at the most, and you come to a conclusion as to what is wrong with you and what you should do about it. Let's not give ourselves too many, let's not believe that we are that omnipotent. Do realize that if you're going to a professional, the professional has become a professional only after X amount of years of work, and everything that's in a textbook may be modified in actual practice. So give the professional the respect he deserves. Of course, you can question him. You have the right to do that. And of course, you can choose your own, make your own decision. But let's not go into this with a skeptical, oh, he's out to get me feeling, which is not appropriate.
Right.
Let's also look at it in terms of that the world is a lovely place and let's do whatever we can to make the environment better, to make pandemics as less as possible, and to support each other rather than downplay what the efforts that everybody is making.
I don't know if we are mentally prepared for another pandemic, but the biggest preparation is for the mental health pandemic.
Yes.
By the end of the day.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kersi.
Thank you.
This is lovely chatting with you.
Okay.